I'm going to jump right in and show the failed components of this engine. What you're looking at is the remains of the number 3 rod bearing. The bearing was so severely worn that it was paper thin, and if you wanted, you could literally fold it in half with your fingers. The bearing had spun inside the rod. This is a common issue on the Mazda FSDE engine. Most of the rod bearing failures I've seen have almost always been number 3 and number 2. I have seen some fail on number 4, but never number 1. As mentioned in the previous video, the valve stem seals had been leaking on the exhaust side of the engine. This is evident when looking at the combustion chambers of the engine. There's a lot of carbon fouling going on here mixed with oil. You may be wondering what the white deposits on the valves are. Well, it's a good thing this kind of happened because you get to discover what it's like to see inside your engine when you use fuel additives. The grayish white deposits are from using fuel additives such as gas treatment and fuel injector cleaners. I used to run these all the time and it clearly shows. My reasons for using these were hopefully to keep the injectors clean, and I must admit that when using the fuel additives, the Protege would return some pretty impressive miles per gallon numbers, and the engine would run butter smooth, but that came at a cost. Though this is not the source of the engine failure. What you see is highly undesirable to have happen inside your engine. I'm not saying anything bad about fuel additives, but if you knew that this would happen, you more than likely would not use these products. Also keep in mind that the catalysts that you see here could also be possibly related to the state this engine was in. It is entirely possible that the additives adhere to the oil foul deposits creating this problem. No one will know for sure that the additives do this on every engine unless someone takes a healthy engine, high compression or otherwise, and then disassemble it to see if any deposits are present after several tanks of gas with fuel additives. I mentioned that I looked at the valves of the engine while it was still in the car and being used. The intake valves were in very good shape and the seals were not leaking on the intake valves. The exhausts were a totally different story here. Remember I mentioned the stalagmite and stalactite looking crystallizations? Well, I wasn't kidding. Mind you, this oil was so baked on, not even a rotating wire brush could remove all the crap from these valves. Looking at the crusted on mess these had, you can see how this would rob someone of fuel economy, engine performance, and power output due to the reduced exhaust flow. There were some deposits on the intake valves, but nothing like the exhaust valves. After a little bit of time with the brush, you can see that these clean up very nicely and are actually reusable. Next, I want to show you an image of a piston from the Mazda FS 2-liter engine. This is not the piston from the FSDE that failed. This is from an FSZE that failed. That's right, I have suffered 2 engine failures in my Mazda Protege, and the second failure was from a faulty spark plug. I'll post that video in a future episode. Somehow I lost the footage which shows me trying to get the oil control rings to move on the FSDE piston, so this still shot will have to do. There are 3 ring sets on this piston. One of the greatest concern is the third oil control ring. They were seized really tight with carbon and oil deposits. When these oil control rings get seized, they allow excessive blow-by gases and combustion byproducts to enter the crankcase. This adds to the oil consumption issue because when seized, they don't do the job of scraping oil from the cylinder walls. It just gets pushed into the combustion chamber where it is burned. So what's causing this to occur? Well, I think I've narrowed it down to 4 different things. Number 1, over-rich fueling parameters with low compression. 2, lack of maintenance, meaning timely oil changes. 3, flawed oil pump machining. 4, improper oil weight. Mazda decided to couple the low compression variant of this engine with very rich fueling parameters. Stoichiometric is usually 14.7 parts air to 1 parts fuel. I didn't mention this during my dyno runs, but I got to see what the computer was picking up through the sensor that was placed inside the tailpipe. I was shocked at what I saw. The highest number I saw was 12.7 to 1, and at one point it was as low as 10.8 to 1, and that was at wide open throttle. That's very rich for an engine with low compression that does not move a lot of air in factory trim. This is evident when you look at the tailpipe of a factory trim Protege without any modifications. The condensation produced carries lots of carbon out of the tailpipe, and there is always a black stream of residue on the mufflers for these cars. That's due to the rich running conditions. If you add an open exhaust or any mods that will make the engine move more air, you'll notice a sharp decline in your fuel economy for this car. You'll also notice your rear bumper will become coated with black soot. Automobile manufacturers usually run vehicles slightly rich from the factory to protect the engine from detonation and pre-ignition. For the Protege, they seem to have went overboard. It's like they got lazy and had a limited budget and only considered the top trim turbocharged Protege and went backwards from there, giving the other base models the same fueling parameters as the turbo car. From what I understand, I think the Mazda Speed ECU and the regular Protege are exactly the same. The MP3 ECU still runs rich but has better advanced timing, so there may be some benefit to switching to that one. When you have a non-turbo car running those rich mixtures, it isn't likely to be burned because the low oxygen count and the excessive carbon is produced as a result. That carbon gets pushed into the oil control rings, and some of it winds up in the crankcase due to blow-by and thus the engine's oil supply. Think of the carbon deposits as sand or granules of material that can dissolve and thicken a fluid. You can pretty much guess what happens to the engine oil at this point. I've seen several Proteges sludged up really bad because of this. You can add to the fact that lack of timely oil changes doesn't help the situation either, as most of us get our Proteges second hand and sometimes third hand, and we have no earthly idea how the previous owners maintained the cars. When the oil turns to sludge, the oil level in the sump decreases, thus lowering valuable oil pressure. Low oil pressure is the #1 cause of rod bearing failures in most engines. But let's look deeper. There's one other issue that plagues the Protege, the oil pump. The oil pump on this engine uses an offset gear drive to produce oil pressure. It was discovered that the gears were not machined to the correct specifications, and as a result, the oil inside the pump produces a frothy foaming condition and lowers the oil pressure, thus creating rod bearing failures. Supposedly, this is nothing to worry about in a daily driving situation, but when pushing the engine over 4,000 RPM for extended periods of time, such as in racing, this phenomenon occurs. I found this out by reading the discoveries of Doc B Racing. The fix was that they took the Protege oil pumps and disassembled them, and coated the gears with a specialized hardened coating. This coating would also build up the gears to the proper tolerances that they should have been machined to. Then the oil return valve would be modified to allow an increase in oil pressure. They would then run 10W40 or 2050 engine oil in these to see consistent oil pressures. As of current, I don't think this service is offered anymore, but a high volume oil pump has been created for the Protege as a result. It is unknown if this problem was associated with the JDM variants of this engine. It was a known issue to racing teams with the US domestic variant of the 2-liter FSDE engine. So what can be done to prevent this from occurring to your Protege? Number 1, use BG engine performance restoration products and then do an oil change after. Number 2, perform timely oil changes at 4,500 to 5,000 miles. 3, use thicker oil weights such as 10W30, 10W40 synthetic. 4, perform the high compression JDM engine swap. 5, invest in a high quality AFR controller. And 6, bolt on a high volume oil pressure oil pump. If you aren't a performance enthusiast, I don't expect you to do all the modifications talked about here. The first thing I would suggest is to use the BG engine flush kits, which can be obtained from Amazon.com. These will help loosen stuck carbon deposits in the engine and hopefully free the piston ring so they can start to function as designed. Should you do this, be sure to read the instructions on the can and be sure to do an oil change immediately afterwards, okay? So when changing the oil, use high quality full synthetics such as Mobil 1 or whatever your brand would be, say maybe Castrol or maybe Liqui Moly or something like that. I currently run 10W40 in my JDM FSZE, and it runs just fine with it. So, and then change your oil every 4,500 to 5,000 miles to prevent the accumulation of carbon deposits on the rings and other engine components. Next, the ECU in the Protege can be tuned, but only with the assistance of a piggyback system. As of now, I know of only one that is supposed to be capable of altering the ECU parameters without the ECU learning around it. I don't have any experience with this piggyback AFR controller, but that will change in the near future, and I'll put up an episode on that after I get used to using it, and that would be the split-second AFR controller for the Protege. Finally, you can swap the engine in this car with the FSZE JDM variant, as I did. I highly recommend this option. Why would you do this? Well, the engine runs a higher compression ratio of 10.4 to 1 instead of 9 to 1. Engines that run higher compression automatically will move more air and be able to burn the fuel-air mixture more completely, not to mention the additional performance output of the engine. The JDM FSZE variant is rated at 163 horsepower, and the variant is what I purchased to replace the US FSDE version. So the trade-off to running the JDM engine is that it will require constant and consistent use of premium fuel, so that means 93 or 92 octane. Okay, the JDM engine will also have the highly sought after FSH9 intake camshaft as shown here. The US version will likely have the FS1G, so if you're looking for a JDM engine, ask if you can have the valve cover removed before you purchase one, or as soon as you get the engine, remove the valve cover and look for the FSH9 intake camshaft. I wanted to interject some thoughts on the Protege's internal components from a performance perspective as well. Take a look at the Protege's crankshaft. Now this is from the US version. I would say this crankshaft could easily handle 450 to 500 plus horsepower with very little issues. Something important I want to point out is that the journal overlap. You may, if you're familiar with Papadakis Racing, Stefan Papadakis, or if you've read some of his past Super Street articles about engine building, he talks about this. And this is where a portion of the journal, rod bearing journal, overlaps the crank main journal. And supposedly, the more overlap a crankshaft has, the stronger it likely will be, and the more horsepower it can handle. Cranks that have very little journal overlap are somewhat weaker and shows that they have been stroked for maximum torque and are likely, they won't do well in high RPM running conditions due to a much poorer rod stroke ratio. So here's a picture of the JDM crankshaft to compare alongside the US version. You can clearly see a difference in quality. Though these engines have the same bore and stroke, the JDM version has a little bit higher quality components inside. So I would say a set of forged connecting rods and some pistons can make a real powerhouse out of this engine, should some of you guys out there who would like to build one of these. You wouldn't have any very little issues with this crankshaft. So I'm pretty sure you can easily get 500-600 horse out of this engine with no problems. Finally, I wanted to show something to the viewer to help you better understand how oil pressure works inside the Mazda FSDE engine. I had the block inside this parts washer tank, cleaning it before putting it away for storage, and I started pushing parts cleaner solvent through the oil galleys and made a bit of a discovery. Now, it is entirely possible that oil pressure can bleed off when pushed a linear distance from the supplying pump. Keep in mind that the solvent being pushed through the galleys is not at the 30 to 86 psi range that this engine operates at, but just pay particular attention to how the fluid has less pressure as it travels away from the entry point or the point where the pressure is the greatest. Here I'm pushing solvent into the oil galleys. The point of entry is where the oil enters the galleys from the position of the oil pump. If an oil filter were installed, you would see that engine oil is pumped directly into the oil filter first before it enters the engine's internals. Oil then comes out of the filter and enters the galleys. Pay particular attention to the arcs of the fluid coming from the main caps as the linear distance from the pump lengthens. Note the first arc is pretty large, and as I move along each main, the arc gets smaller and smaller. Thus, per oil pressure, it is possible that the oil pressure can decrease in much the same way and that the arcs of the fluid get smaller. Keep in mind, this fluid is not at the 30 to 86 psi range that the engine operates at, and the temperature is cold, and thus, since temperature directly affects pressure, the viscosity of the solvent is unknown. This is only meant to pluck the active thinking side of your brain. Pause. Another very effective way to control oil pressure is to use high-quality filters. I would choose brands such as Denso, Bosch, Mann, or Mahle Cleveite. The metal the oil filter is constructed from is often very thin. When oil temps and pressures increases, it can cause the walls of the filter to expand, lowering oil pressure. You may have seen or even wondered why Japanese racing teams would often place a hose clamp around the oil filter when racing their cars. This is done to limit the expansion of the oil filter and thus helps to control valuable oil pressure. If it goes a long way for racing teams, it could also be beneficial for everyday use. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to look at these videos. I hope you found them helpful. I've noticed my subscriber count is creeping up ever so often, so thank you guys for all the support and watching the videos. If you like what you see, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.